Hi, everybody, and welcome to Headway, a show that informs our audience about political issues that affect the nation, the region, and our local area. On this episode, I will be speaking with Bella Robinson, the Executive Director of COYOTE Rhode Island, a nonprofit group that advocates for policies that promote the health and safety of people involved in the sex industry. I'm talking to Bella Robinson today, and she's from COYOTE Rhode Island, and we're here to talk about her advocacy that she does for sex workers in Rhode Island. How you doing, Bella?
I'm pretty good. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here and help to educate some people.
Awesome. Great. Can you just start off telling us what COYOTE is and how it started?
Sure. COYOTE stands for Call Up Your Old Tired Ethics, and it was actually started in the 70s by Margot St. James, who filed a court case called COYOTE versus Roberts. And in the 70s in Rhode Island, all prostitution was a felony. And the language of the bill and the law was very vague that anyone that had indiscriminate sex could be charged with prostitution. And Margot's complaint was, one, they were only arresting the women, and two, what right did the state have to do and the sex lives of consenting adults in private? And the case was thrown out as moot because they changed legislation and made prostitution go from a felony to a misdemeanor. And the wording of it only included public prostitution. But the courts found that her suit did change the law, so they had to pay her attorney's fees. So no one really understood this until around 2003, when some of the spas were raided, and they hired an attorney, Michael Kaliska, who did a little research and explained to the judge that they didn't break the law, and the judge agreed. And then it took several years from 2003 to 2009 to create the trafficking hysteria, to then again criminalize all sex work in Rhode Island, and it's been downhill ever since. But we do have some great data. A good friend of mine, Scott Cummings, did a research project from 2003 to 2009 right here in Rhode Island. Gonorrhea went down 30% and rape went down 40% for the entire state. So we do know decriminalization has a great health and safety aspect to it. And when we think about criminalization, whether, we're not trying to claim there's not trafficking victims. Our claim is it's not to the extent that law enforcement wants you to believe, because they're profiting off of the criminalization. But it makes sense that anytime someone can't come forward and tell you someone's abusing me or robbing me or assaulting me, that the predator has all the power, and we're not going to catch the bad guys. And you'll probably remember the Craigslist killer back in 2009.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
he killed the girl in Boston. He came to Rhode Island and tried to rob an escort, and she dialed 911, and they caught him before he hurt anyone else. And she only dialed 911 because she was decriminalized, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So yeah. So we kind of relaunched COYOTE in 2010 as a counter to them recriminalizing us. And we've been up and running for organizing under criminalization for about 10 years now.
So what's your background personally, Bella?
My background is I'm actually a sex worker. I still earn my living as a sex worker. I've been a sex worker for 35 years. In my younger years, it was not that empowering. I was a street-based worker, had drug issues, blah, blah, blah. So in the sex industry, there is all different levels of empowerment. When you take someone that has to pay rent by tomorrow, they don't have a lot of, ability to tell a client no who offers them less money. Mm-hmm. If you have, you're homeless or on the street or have addiction issues, you might not be able to negotiate for, condom use. Women of color, trans people, migrant workers, they're marketed at lower rates. So I've always said, if you want to know if someone's being exploited or harmed, the best way to do that is to ask them, because everybody has a different experience. And The trafficking narrative kind of wants to say any of our associates, friends, if you have an office assistant that screens your clients or a driver, all these people are now pimps and traffickers. And, our families, our friends, anyone that is, it's almost like being a runaway teenager where anyone that knows you is in trouble just for
Okay.
associating with you.
Yeah. So, can you talk about, all right, so let's talk about that. So some of the misconceptions about what's trafficking and what's not, because I know you were saying like a lot of
On a federal level.
anti-trafficking stuff is what's kind of led a lot of the legislation lately to
And this
happen.
started around 2000 in the Bush administration, and it actually brought the right wing with the religious, pro-lifers, and it created this really big political party that the Bush administration started. But the federal definition of trafficking was using force, coercion, or fraud to force someone into prostitution, or if a minor's involved, even if the minor's under their own control, they're automatically a victim. And they also deem, if you're undocumented, that you're a victim and you have no choice. Now, over the years, they've totally conflated sex work with prostitution, and we'll hear the police say how they rescued these people, but they arrested them. And what they do is they tell them immediately, if you won't say you're forced and you're not willing to cooperate, testify against all your coworkers, you're going to jail, and we're going to tell the world that you're a prostitute. And we're going to put your name and photo in the newspaper and on TV. So what we see is a lot of this is by federal funding. The government is spending about $1 billion a year. They'll give grants to any nonprofit who will, one, create awareness about trafficking. They can't support decriminalization or harm reduction for sex workers. And their job is to host public trainings on how to spot trafficking. They're basically asking the public to become vigilantes and snitch on if you think she's a sex worker, call the police. Now, we know handcuffs doesn't equal rescue, and you can't be a victim and a criminal at the same time. And they were very crafty in why they did this. And I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but there was a 1913 Supreme Court case which said the federal government could not make prostitution laws, that it was left up to the state. But the federal government can make trafficking laws. So years ago, I met a woman who had Kathleen Chong, who was the co-founder of Palalas Project, which is one of the biggest trafficking hotlines in the country, funded at about $8 million a year just to answer the phone, and they have no services. But this idea that she will tell people, because she's Asian American, Ivy League education, but she portrays this as these spa women, it could have been me, and just totally removing their experiences, them trying to lift themselves out of poverty. And if we stay in the problem, then all these people stay in business and it expands criminal industrial complex. We've seen things like up in New York with diversion court, where nobody is asked if they're a trafficking victim. They're told you're going to plead guilty and go into diversion, or you're being charged right now. Okay. And there's no shelter or housing or childcare. All it is you're going to go to free yoga class to deal with your trauma and counseling and this shame-based stuff, but none of it is services that actually help lift someone out of poverty. So
yoga doesn't lift you out of poverty. Just kidding.
Right, right. Because if I dump you at Crossroads, magically you're lifted out of poverty and you're now rescued. And we know the poorer you are, the easier it is to exploit you again, right? So another thing they do is any government-funded research on trafficking has to be about how to catch traffickers and prosecute them quicker. So they have no interest in the people involved, making people whole, what their experiences are we doing this right, or are there better things to do? So what we've done over the years is we've done a humongous amount of research, because most research is just someone's opinion about what they think about prostitution or strip clubs or dancers or anyone in the sex industry. So we got a small grant from the American Sociology Association, and we surveyed 63 Rhode Island sex workers in 2014, and 24% of them reported being robbed, raped, or assaulted by police. Well, then we did a 145 question survey on 1,515 sex workers across the country. Think about how much data that is.
Yeah.
Our health and policy advisor wrote her thesis on the HIV and sexual health part. We found out that sex workers had better condom use than the general public, but of course, we're always claimed to be the vectors of disease.
Yeah.
She went on to present at AIDS conference and harm reduction, and we just released. We're waiting for the CME office to approve them, but it's a 3-series module of continuing medical education class to train medical providers to treat sex workers as they would anyone else, because I have a right to go to my doctor and ask questions about my body and not get a lecture, not be pressed, then telling me there's better ways in the world. Well, can you find me a job that pays a living wage? Do you even have any options for me? And, so when we think about hate crimes and haters, especially this is a great era, 2020, if you hate on gay people, half the country will stand up and say, no, we're going to support them. Okay. If you hate on undocumented people, half the country will say, no, we're going to support them. And you hate on Black people, more than half the country will come out. But the one thing, no matter what your class, race, education, that is sociably acceptable to hate on is sex workers. Okay. Because I want you to think about this. How old were when you knew what a prostitute was? Usually by 8 or 10. You learn this from TV and cop shows and adult conversations. And, when, kids are starting to look at porn and all this kind of stuff. So nowhere do we get an education. Our kids aren't even being taught sex education in school, let alone any conversations about respect and consent and things like that. So, we're really easy scapegoat. We're one of the most underserved populations as far as trying to, obtain grants and do research and access resources. And we know that, I also study a lot about, poverty and homeless people and people of color and LGBT and trans, because all these things interconnect. Yeah. We know there's an affordable housing crisis. We know nobody can live on $10, even $15 an hour. And our legislatures don't want to talk about the police robbing and raping sex workers or murdering people of color. And while most of the country are kind of getting on board with the police or the abusers, they just believe everything they say about trafficking. Give you another example is in Pawtucket, the way they won't leave those Asian spas alone. And ICE even raided one in December. These women are in their 50s or 60s. They're not trafficking victims. Most of them are here legally, but they just won't leave them alone. And how is harassing them helping our youth? If we divert the trafficking funding to actually support youth services, just like we want to defund the police to create housing, and that would be a more responsible response and we would get better results. But the trafficking thing, you can make movies and write books and have scandalous headlines, and they even parade victims around at fundraisers and they groom them to tell them, I want you to say how you were raped by 30 or 40 men.
Bella, can we move on to just do, because we're like, that was a long time on that question.
It's a lot of information, it really is.
Definitely. Can you just talk about, some of the stuff that you guys do? I know that you do work with incarcerated sex workers. It's like a pen pal program. Do you want to talk about the stuff that COYOTE does with them?
One of our sister organizations, SWAT Behind Bars, we started 3 years ago with 2 pen pals, and now we have over 100. They're from all over the country. Right now during the pandemic, they need our support more than ever. But a lot of these women have nowhere to go when they get out. There's very few halfway houses, transitional programs. And if you have nowhere to go, you're going back to jail, or you're going to be exploited, or you're just going to return to drugs or whatever it was you were doing. You really don't even have a chance. I was previously incarcerated in Florida for 5 years over a drug charge. And I want you to think about that. It did 5 years for a nonviolent crime, but you can rape a child and be out of prison quicker than that. And I was lucky to have a supportive family. And, and recovery network and 12-step networks around me to succeed. So we try to fill in those hoops and just do small things like, send them a $100 gift card and a smartphone with 90 days of service when they get out. And we meet them where we are. We get that they're going to continue to be in bad relationships, and some of them are going to continue to do drugs. And it's not about trying to change someone's behavior. It's trying to meet them where they are and love them enough and hope that they start to make better decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
We also
I
do
know.
street outreach and spa outreach too, but that's on hold with the pandemic.
Okay. Oh, so you were doing, so yeah, can you talk a little bit about what the outreach that you do with them is?
Well, the street outreach, we would go down to Broad Street near McDonald's where the empty parking lot there is. And we don't care if you're a sex worker, you're homeless, or you're poor. When you come up, we have hygiene kits, we have condoms, we have all the harm reduction for drug stuff and
Mhm.
snacks and waters, and we just give things out. And when they come up, we go, "What do you want?" We bag it up and give it to them, and it's cute because sometimes they'll say, "Are you from the church?" And we say, "No, we're sex workers and community volunteers." But about a year and a half ago, we also developed a migrant sex worker outreach program. We transcribed our material to Korean and Chinese, and we had a Korean speaking student that started doing outreach to the spas once a month. And, she would bring them a gift basket. And, the way I trained her is only stay 5 minutes, don't even say the word sex workers, tell them you're from a human rights organization to contact Coyote if they have problems with their immigration status or problems being harassed by the police. So we try to do it in a very respectful way where they're not getting anxious and I understand why they mistrust people because the last people that went around and surveyed spa workers resulted in really stigmatizing them and
Yeah.
criminalizing them.
Gotcha. So can you talk about some of your, I mean, the goals that of legislation that you want to see happening?
Absolutely. So last year, Representative Williams sponsored a bill called House Resolution 5354, and it simply asked for a legislation committee to study revising commercial sex laws in Rhode Island. And it put Coyote on the board and someone from the health department, attorney general's office, public defender's office, the ACLU, and all these people. And this is exactly what they did in New Zealand. And even then it took them 10 years to decriminalize.
Hmm.
And we'll get to in a minute, there's a big difference between legalization and decriminalization. No one wants to be legalized
Okay, I was going to ask
because
you that. I saw that on your
and
website, so
what
I was
it
going to ask
is
you about
then the
that. Yeah.
police run around to see who's licensed or
Yeah.
not. And you have to take the police out of the equation to get rid of that corruption and that violence. So we had a great hearing. It didn't get out of committee. Of course, not much is happening this year, even though there's a new bill. And we do understand between the pandemic and other social justice movements like Black Lives Matters, what we're doing has now been put on the back burner. We were getting
Mhm.
close. We've now been taken back. But it's really not just about winning decrim. I'm going to tell you why, because I used to think it was too. If we get decriminalization, they're just going to keep trying to take it away like they do abortion. It's never going to end.
Okay.
So our job is to start educating the public to what state-sponsored violence and systematic oppression and the harms criminalization. And I think the shame-based counseling, sex workers, like especially if they're court-ordered,
Okay.
it's no different than conversion therapy is to gay people. It's very psychologically damaging. There's no benefit from this.
Hmm.
And we're not trying to say that some people didn't have horrible, violent, and bad experiences. Of course, some people did. But that's not the norm. And they want to make our clients out to look like they're predators and,
Hmm.
bad guys. And quite frankly, they're men from all walks of life. And
Yeah.
the average client is a middle-aged white man because they're the ones with disposable incomes.
Yeah.
Um, so, in any situation, we can take any population of people. I don't care if you can't say this, they're all good or bad or wrong, or they're just people. And sex workers have been like locked into this box that once you're a sex worker, you can never be anything else. You can't be an academic. You can't have another career. You can't, being a parent, all of that becomes invisible. And the fact that you're a sex worker is the only thing that seems to be important or relevant to anyone else.
Yeah.
And sex workers are, their kids go to the same school. They shop in the same so they redirect a huge amount of money back into poor communities.
Hmm.
They tip well, and they are part of our communities. And sadly, our communities are not providing us the same support. Even when we look at LGBT,
Okay.
their rights were won off the fact that trans sex workers were at Stonewall. And the mob ran the prostitutes out of the bar. If the sex workers didn't want the cross dressers and the trans people there, they wouldn't have been allowed to be there. But that's been whitewashed out of that history. And because there's so much stigma about being gay or trans, let alone sex work, they just are too scared to add that double stigma to the situation.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how the police or whoever can keep like, let's say the police, right? How the police can work to keep sex workers safe, from violence by, by clients, by, people,
That's
just
right.
general people. How they do that, in like
Well,
while,
right now they
right,
don't
right.
do that.
Okay. Yeah.
And actually, in Alaska and several places where I know, and I'll give you an example. Recently, for years, there was a guy called Joey the Player. He was a CEO in New Jersey who lured high-price escorts from New York, and when he would send them a private car, offer them thousands of dollars, and when he got there and they wanted their money, he would beat them up and rape them. And finally, I don't know, I'll have to tell you about how FOSTA assessed the law, kicked sex workers kind of off the internet and took away their safety platforms where they would share safety information.
Hmm.
So once they couldn't do that, Joey started reappearing in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. And a couple months ago, he was arrested in Massachusetts and extradited to New Jersey. He's being held with no bond and swapped behind bars, got an attorney so the woman could come forward, and got the FBI involved to report crime. What I want to point out in the UK, there's a thing called the Merseyside model. And even
Okay.
though both buying and selling sex is still illegal, the police were so angry about so many street-based workers that were being victims of violence that they created a law that any act of violence towards a sex worker was a hate crime.
Hmm.
And within a year, they saw the rape conviction for sex workers went to 67%, but for the general public, it was 20-something percent. And guess what rape conviction in the United States is?
I don't know.
5%.
Okay.
That's of people that are arrested.
Um,
So 95% of them aren't convicted,
mm,
and we only solve 17% of murders.
yeah.
So, and if law enforcement wants to help catch the bad guys, they're going to have to stop promoting violence and lying about things. They're going to have to build trust with communities. They're going to have some kind of system. Well, think about things where there's 500,000 untested rape kits. So the
Yeah.
police don't think rape's a big deal, but they get a lot of money to do prostitution stings. And that brings me to Swanee Hunt from Massachusetts, who runs an NGO called Abolition Now.
Okay.
And Swanee Hunt was caught giving prosecutors in several states hundreds of thousands of dollars in grant money if they agree to do reverse stings to get clients until they caught so many clients. Now
Okay.
imagine if I could go give the police money to go investigate what I wanted them to go investigate.
Yeah.
I think we all kind of want the cops to go investigate rape and murder
Yeah.
and violent crimes and stop harassing poor people for vice crimes and hookers and and street people and all this other stuff that we waste all the resources on.
All right. So, are there any legislative victories that Coyote has had besides that? Not really. I mean, even though that wasn't actually a full
Well, we didn't
victory.
really have a victory, but we also got Senator Sam Bell last year to introduce Senate Bill, I think it was 309, but it basically was a bill that said um, not police officers could not engage with people detained or in custody. So we found out in 35 states, police can engage in sex with you and then arrest you for
Mm,
prostitution. And I think we can all agree that it's not okay for cops to be engaging in sex with people. And that kind of started up in New York when those two cops raped that 17-year-old in the van and threw her out. And
yeah.
then they told the court, well, we didn't rape her. She offered to have sex with us if we didn't arrest her. So when you're under the threat of arrest, you can never really truly consent. But they want to claim we can't consent to sex workers because we're poor, but everybody's poor and everybody has to work for a living. And if you're exploited in any other labor sector, no one seems to care if it doesn't involve sex. Of course, we do care about all labor sectors. I don't care if you're on a farm, you're a fisherman or a domestic worker, you should have safe working conditions, fair pay, and be
Yeah.
treated decently. And there should be a process. And we know that one thing I wanted to point out in New Zealand, they did a 5-year review after they decriminalized, and they actually did it twice. Okay. And they found out that trafficking did not increase. There was only one trafficking case. Sex workers liked the law, felt more empowered. Violence went down. The only category of people that were still being exploited were undocumented people. Because if you go to New Zealand, and even if you have like a legal work visa, you can't even be a stripper.
Yeah.
So the one population that was still criminalized in some aspect was the only one left to exploit. And it goes to show the good wind that, and it's the same thing. Remember when they told us if they legalized weed, everything would go bad. And we always knew that it would take the bad guys out of the picture. And even think about the word trafficking. It makes you think about borders and drugs and guns and cartels and really bad people. And they're really talking about the majority of them are women because male sex workers aren't being policed. There's no vice stings on them. They're very rarely arrested, and they don't care if they're a 15-year-old boy being exploited. And the youth report did show that almost 50% of those 1,000 youths were boys, but they're left out of the picture because this is all about saving young women from having sex and being corrupted. In the
So Bella, can you so we're pretty much out of time. So I just wanted to know if there's, if you can just share how people can find out more about Coyote, how they can get in contact with you.
Our website is at coyoteri.org. We're on Facebook as Coyote. We're on Instagram as Coyote RI. We're on Twitter. We have all kinds of resources and data and information. We love to engage with people. We are really trying to, it's really even hard for some of the trafficking orgs aren't bad, but if they take that money, it's a gag order. But some of them do have good intentions. Some of them have bad intentions. So we need to learn to put those two things together to work together. And we need to start asking sex workers what they want.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming on. It was great talking to you.
Appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Have a good night. Thank you.
You too. Bye. And thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time on the next episode of Headway.